Her brothers took everything they could. The house she barely remembered, the stocks, the savings accounts drained to legal dust. But in their haste, they forgot the one thing their father had sealed shut in 1962, a place left to rot in a town whose name she'd only ever seen on a faded legal document, the old feed store. What I discovered there wasn't just about a forgotten property. It was about a forgotten promise, and a truth that would force me to choose between running from the past or rebuilding it with my own two hands. If you've ever felt like you were left with nothing, only to find out that nothing was the beginning of everything, hit that subscribe button and stick with me. This story is for you. The day I turned 18 felt less like a celebration and more like a final notice. For 2 years, since my father's sudden death, the state had been my legal guardian, a role it performed with the detached efficiency of a filing clerk. My life was a stack of papers in a beige folder on the desk of a woman named Carol, whose sighs were longer than our conversations. My older half-brothers, Richard and Mark, were just names on a different set of papers, men I hadn't seen since the funeral. They were from my father's first life, the one before my mother, before me. They were grown, with families and mortgages and a coldness that seemed to predate my existence. They had handled the estate. That was the phrase Carol used. Handled. It sounded so neat, so final. It meant they had systematically liquidated every asset tied to our father's name, leaving behind a wake of legal fees and an echoing silence where a legacy should have been. Carol slid one last envelope across the particle board desk that separated us. It was thin, flimsy, the kind that held bad news. "This is it, Maya," she said, her voice attempting a gentleness that didn't fit her. "The final disposition from the estate lawyer. You're officially aged out. This is your copy." I didn't reach for it. My hands were tucked under my legs, pressing into the cheap vinyl of the visitor's chair. The air in the office smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant, the signature perfume of institutional care. "There's nothing left," I said. It wasn't a question. It was a fact I had been living with for 2 years. The house in the city was sold to cover debts. Your father's portfolio was complicated. Your brothers managed the resolution. Again, those sterile, evasive words. Managed. Resolution. They were words designed to build a wall between a feeling and a fact. The fact was, they took it all. The feeling was a deep, gnawing hollowness that had become my constant companion. "Not exactly nothing," Carol said, tapping a perfectly manicured nail on the envelope. "There is one remaining asset. It was considered a liability, frankly. The taxes on it are in arrears, and it's been adjudicated to you as the sole remaining heir, not party to the primary estate settlement." I finally looked at the envelope. My name was typed on the front, Maya Vance. Below it, an address in a town called Oak Haven. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "A commercial property," she said, consulting her screen. "Deeded as Vance and Son Feed and Supply. According to the county records, it was boarded up in 1962. Hasn't been opened since. Your brothers waived any claim to it. The lawyer, a Mr. Abernathy, said it would cost more to tear it down than the land is worth. A feed store. A place my father had owned and abandoned more than 20 years before I was even born. It sounded like a joke. A punchline to the long, sad story of my inheritance. It was the piece of trash left over after the vultures had picked the carcass clean. "So they left me a ruin," I said, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. "Happy birthday to me." Carol gave me a look of practiced sympathy. "There's a check from the state for your transition, $500. It's not much, but it's a start." She pushed another, thicker envelope next to the first one. $500 and a derelict building 3 hours away. That was the sum total of my life, my future. The weight of it was suffocating. I took the envelopes. The paper felt cold and impersonal. "The bus to Oak Haven leaves at 7 tomorrow morning," Carol added, already turning back to her computer. The message was clear. My time was up. My file was closed. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the edge of the twin bed in my room at the group home, the two envelopes lying next to me like a verdict. I thought about my father, not the distant, complicated figure from the legal documents, but the man who smelled of sawdust and Old Spice, the man who taught me how to skip stones on the river, whose quiet presence was the only home I'd ever really known. He was a carpenter, a handyman. He could fix anything. That's what I remembered. He never spoke of a feed store, never mentioned a town called Oakhaven, and he certainly never talked about Richard and Mark with anything other than a deep, weary sigh. After my mother died when I was 10, it was just the two of us. He worked constantly, his hands always rough with calluses, his eyes always tired. But he was there. And then, a heart attack at 58, and he wasn't. The system swept in, and my brothers, who I barely knew, became the executors of his absence. They had dissected his life for parts, and this crumbling feed store was the one organ they deemed unfit for harvest. Why? Why seal it up and walk away? Why leave it festering for decades, only for it to land in my lap like a curse? A deep, irrational anger began to smolder in my chest. Anger at my brothers for their greed, at the state for its indifference, and at my father for the mountain of secrets he had apparently left behind. I picked up the thin envelope. Mr. Abernathy's contact information was on the letterhead. I could call him. I could tell him to let it go, let the county take it for back taxes. I could take the $500 and disappear, find a cheap room in the city, and try to build a life from scratch. That was the sensible option, the path of least resistance. But as I stared at the address, Vance & Son Feed and Supply, 14 Main Street, Oakhaven, something shifted in me. It was the only thing left. The only tangible piece of him that my brothers hadn't touched, hadn't sold, hadn't erased. It was a ruin, yes, but it was my ruin. The bus ride was a slow bleed from gray to green. The concrete sprawl of the city gave way to suburbs, then to patchy farmland, and finally to the dense, rolling hills of the countryside. I watched the world go by through a grimy window, my reflection a pale ghost superimposed over the passing trees. The $500, minus the one-way bus ticket, felt like a pathetic shield against the vastness of the world. I was heading toward a place I'd never seen, a building that was likely a hazard, with no plan and no one to call if I got into trouble. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but there was nothing to turn back to. The group home wasn't a home. The city was just a collection of streets where I had no anchor. Oakhaven was a question mark, and right then, a question mark was better than a period. The bus wheezed into the town's single depot station just after 10 in the morning. I stepped out into air that smelled of damp earth, cut grass, and something vaguely sweet, like hay. Oakhaven wasn't so much a town as a long, sleepy main street pretending to be one. A diner with a flickering neon sign, a hardware store, a post office, a grocery, and a handful of other storefronts, some occupied, some vacant. It was quiet. The kind of quiet that feels heavy, full of unspoken history. I shouldered my backpack, my only luggage, and started walking. Number 14 was at the far end of the street, just before the road curved out of town and back into the woods. It looked even worse than I had imagined. It wasn't just a building, it was a monument to neglect. The facade was faded clapboard, the paint peeling away in long, leprous strips to reveal the dark, weathered wood beneath. The words Vance & Son, Feed and Supply were still visible, painted in what was once a cheerful blue, now a ghostly, flaking whisper. The two large display windows on either side of the main door were boarded up from the inside. Thick planks of wood crisscrossed over them like giant X's. The front door itself was solid oak, but it was grayed with age and sealed with a heavy-duty padlock and a thick, rusted chain that looked like it had been salvaged from a ship's anchor. A thick layer of dirt and grime covered everything, and a stubborn vine had worked its way up one side of the doorframe, its green leaves a stark contrast to the decay. It didn't look like a building that had been closed, it looked like a tomb. I stood on the cracked sidewalk, just staring. A few cars passed, the drivers giving me a curious glance. A girl with a backpack staring at the old derelict feed store. I was already a spectacle. This was a mistake, a colossal $500 mistake. My heart sank. The anger from the night before had evaporated, replaced by a familiar, crushing wave of despair. I was a fool. An 18-year-old fool standing in front of a pile of garbage that technically belonged to her. I walked closer, my boots crunching on fallen debris. I reached out and touched the padlock. It was cold and pitted with rust. The chain was immovable. There was no way I was getting in without heavy tools. Defeated, I sat down on the curb, my back to the decaying storefront. What now? I could get back on a bus, but where would I go? I could find the county office and sign the place over. Just wash my hands of it. As I sat there, stewing in my own hopelessness, an old pickup truck, the color of a faded robin's egg, pulled up across the street. A man who looked to be in his late 60s, with a face as weathered as the buildings around him, got out. He wore overalls and a baseball cap. He ambled over to the hardware store, then stopped, looking first at the feed store, then at me. He walked across the street, his steps slow and deliberate. "You lost, miss?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. I shook my head, not trusting myself to speak. "Just looking." "Not much to look at there," he said, nodding toward the store. "Been shut up like that since before I was a teenager. Old man Vance closed it down. Said he was moving on. Never came back." Old man Vance. My father. It was jarring to hear him called that. "He was my father," I said, the words feeling strange in my mouth. The man's eyebrows shot up in surprise. He squinted at me, his eyes a pale, watery blue. "Well, I'll be," he murmured. "You've got his eyes. Dark, serious." "I'm Earl. I run the hardware store over there." He stuck out a large, calloused hand. I took it. "Maya." "Maya," he repeated, testing the name. "Thomas's girl." I'll be damned. We all figured his boys from his first marriage would be the ones to finally tear this place down. He gestured at the padlock. "You aimin' to get inside?" I nodded mutely. "Well, you'll need more than a stern look to get through that. That's a C-grade industrial lock. Thomas put it on there himself. Bought it from my dad." He stroked his chin, a thoughtful look on his face. "The story was he went bust. But it was always a bit strange. A man doesn't lock up a failed business like he's protecting gold. He just walks away." The way he said it sent a shiver down my spine. Protecting gold. He looked from the lock back to my face. A flicker of something, pity maybe, or just plain human kindness, crossed his features. "Tell you what, you look like you could use a coffee. Come on over to the diner, my treat. Then we'll see about getting you some bolt cutters." Sitting in the diner, a cracked ceramic mug of hot coffee warming my hands, I felt a tiny shard of the despair begin to melt away. Earl didn't ask a lot of prying questions. He just sat with me, talking about the town, about how it had changed, about how it had stayed the same. He told me he remembered my father as a quiet, hard-working man who mostly kept to himself. "He was a good man, Thomas," Earl said, swirling the dregs of his coffee. "But he had a sadness about him, especially after his first wife left and took the boys. It was like a part of him just shut down. Then one day, the store was boarded up and he was gone. After coffee, he was true to his word. He led me back to his hardware store, a magical place that smelled of metal, oil, and sawdust. It was packed to the gills with tools, paints, and every conceivable piece of hardware. He pulled a massive pair of bolt cutters from a rack. They were at least 3 feet long and heavy. "These should do it," he said, handing them to me. "No charge, just bring 'em back when you're done." I tried to offer him some money, but he just waved his hand dismissively. "Nonsense. Call it a welcome to Oakhaven gift. Or a welcome back, I suppose. Your name's on the deed, after all." His simple act of trust was so foreign, so unexpected, that I almost cried. In the system, everything was a transaction, every kindness documented in triplicate. Here, a man was lending me a $50 tool based on a memory of my father's eyes. Armed with the bolt cutters, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. I went back to the store. The street was still quiet. I took a deep breath, positioned the jaws of the cutters around one of the thick chain links, and squeezed with all my might. It was harder than I thought. I had to put my entire body weight into it, grunting with the effort. The metal groaned in protest, and then, with a loud, satisfying snap, the link broke. The chain fell to the ground with a heavy clatter. One down, one to go. The padlock was even tougher. I had to brace the door with my foot and pull, my muscles screaming. The shackle resisted, but I was fueled by a strange mix of desperation and adrenaline. Finally, with a sharp crack, it gave way. I pulled the broken lock free. For the first time in over half a century, the door was unsealed. My heart was pounding. I put my hand on the doorknob. It was cold and stiff. I turned it. A loud click echoed in the silence. I pushed. The door scraped against the floor, groaning like a wounded animal, and opened into a wall of darkness that smelled of dust, decay, and time itself. The air that rushed out was thick and stale, a preserved breath from 1962. It was an atmosphere heavy with the ghosts of forgotten commerce. The faint, phantom scent of grain, leather, and dry goods, all buried under a thick blanket of dust. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, letting my eyes adjust to the gloom. The only light came from the open door behind me, cutting a bright, angular path into the darkness. It illuminated a world frozen in time. Dust motes, thick as insects, danced in the beam of light. To my left and right, the boarded-up windows plunged the front of the store into near-total blackness. Directly ahead, the main aisle stretched back into the cavernous space, flanked by shelves and stacks of merchandise, all shrouded in a uniform gray film. It was like stepping into a photograph, a monochrome snapshot of a long dead day. I took a tentative step inside, my boots crunching on something. I looked down. The floor was covered in a thin layer of what looked like scattered grain and dirt, tracked in 50 years ago and left undisturbed. The sound was unnervingly loud in the profound silence. I pulled my phone from my pocket and turned on its flashlight, the small, intense beam cutting a new path through the darkness. I swept it across the room. The shelves were still stocked. There were sacks leaning against the wall, branded with faded logos for poultry feed and cattle grain. They were hard as rocks, their contents petrified over the decades. On the shelves sat small metal tins of oil, boxes of work gloves stiffened into claws, spools of twine, and rows of glass jars filled with nails and screws, all obscured by a layer of grime. It was a general store as much as a feed supply, a place for a farmer to get everything he needed in one stop. I moved deeper into the store, the beam of my light dancing over the silent displays. The silence was the most unsettling part. It wasn't just quiet, it was a dead, soundproofed stillness, the kind that makes you aware of your own heartbeat, the blood rushing in your ears. I felt like an intruder, a grave robber. Every step felt like a desecration. I ran my hand along a wooden counter, leaving a clean streak in the thick dust. The wood beneath was solid, smooth. My father had stood here. He had leaned on this counter, rung up sales, talked to customers. The thought was so immediate, so visceral, that it made my throat tighten. At the back of the store, the main counter stood like a judge's bench. On it sat an old, ornate cash register, its metal tarnished to a dull pewter. I pressed one of the keys. It didn't move, frozen shut by time and humidity. Behind the counter, a door stood slightly ajar, leading into what must have been the office. This was it. If there were any answers to be found, they would be in there. The office was small, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, with a single desk, a chair, and a large black safe tucked into the corner. Unlike the front of the store, the office felt more personal, more disturbed. Papers were scattered on the floor, and a desk drawer was pulled out, its contents dumped. It looked like it had been searched, hastily and violently. My heart began to beat faster. This wasn't just a business that had been closed. Something had happened here. Earl's words came back to me. A man doesn't lock up a failed business like he's protecting gold. The safe was the obvious prize. It was old, with a single combination dial. There was no hope of me ever getting into it. My eyes scanned the room, looking for anything else, anything that might be a clue. The desk was a mess. I sifted through the yellowed invoices and receipts on the floor. They were all dated October 1962, the last few weeks of business. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, just orders for feed, payments for supplies. Then my light caught something on the wall. Above the desk, there was a framed photo. It was a picture of two young boys, maybe 8 and 10, with slicked back hair and matching formal outfits. They were smiling awkwardly at the camera. Richard and Mark. My brothers. My father had kept a picture of them in his office. A bitter taste filled my mouth. I took the photo off the wall. It was heavier than it should have been. I turned it over. The backing was thick cardboard, held in place by metal tabs. Something felt off. I used my thumbnail to pry one of the tabs open, then another. The cardboard backing came loose. Taped to the inside of it was a small, flat key. It was an old-fashioned skeleton key, the kind for an interior door or a piece of furniture. It wasn't for the safe. My eyes darted around the office, the desk. There was a small, locked drawer on the side, one that hadn't been forced open like the others. My hand was trembling as I inserted the key. It fit perfectly. With a soft click, the lock turned. I pulled the drawer open. It was empty, except for a single, thick manila envelope. There was no name on it, no label. It was just there, waiting. I lifted it out. It was heavy, dense. I could feel the sharp edges of paper inside, but also something more solid. With shaking fingers, I tore open the flap. The contents of the envelope spilled onto the dusty surface of the desk. The first thing I saw was money, a thick stack of $20 bills bound with a brittle rubber band. I counted it quickly, 100 bills, $2,000. It was a fortune to me, more money than I had ever held in my life. It was survival. It was a bus ticket to anywhere, a deposit on an apartment, a new start. But beneath the cash, there was something else, a sheaf of papers folded in half. They were letters. The paper was yellowed and fragile, covered in a tight, controlled handwriting I recognized instantly from the few birthday cards I had from my father. My breath caught in my chest. The top page wasn't a letter. It was a ledger sheet with columns of names and numbers. The names were unfamiliar, the numbers were large, but it was the letters that held me captive. There were 3 of them, each several pages long. They were all addressed the same way. To my daughter. My daughter. He had written them for me, or for a daughter he hoped to have one day. He had sealed them in this drawer, in this tomb of a store, decades before I was born. My hands shook so badly I could barely hold the first page. I unfolded it, the old paper crinkling in the dead silence of the office. The flashlight beam trembled as I began to read. To my daughter, the first letter began. If you are reading this, It means several things have happened. It means I am gone. It means the state has seen fit to give you the deed to this old place. And it means that you, my brave girl, have found your way inside. I am sorry. I am sorry for the state you must have found this in, and I am sorry for the questions that must be screaming in your head. I can't answer all of them, but I owe you the truth. At least, as much of it as I can give you. This store was my first dream. I built it with my own 2 hands, right after I came back from the war. Vance and Son. The son was wishful thinking then. Later, it was for Richard and Mark. But the dream soured. Oakhaven, for all its quiet charm, had a rot in it back then. A network of men, led by a man named Costello, who liked to invest in local businesses. They were criminals, plain and simple, racketeers. They saw my store, with its constant flow of cash and goods, as a perfect vehicle for washing their dirty money. Your brother's mother, my first wife, Eleanor, her family was connected to them. It's how they got their hooks in me. At first it was small things, a loan I didn't need, favors I couldn't refuse. Before I knew it, my ledgers were a work of fiction, and my store was a hub for their operations. I was trapped. They owned me. The ledger sheet you found with this letter is the real one, the one I kept hidden. It shows their money, the dirty money, flowing through my books. It's the proof of what they were doing. I paused, my head spinning. I looked at the ledger sheet again. Columns of figures, dates in 1961 and 1962. It looked like a confession. My father wasn't just a feed store owner. He was entangled with the mob. My image of him, the quiet, gentle carpenter, shattered. He had a secret life, a dark past he had never hinted at. I continued reading, my heart pounding against my ribs. I saw what was happening, the letter went on. I saw how they consumed everything they touched. They wanted the store, and eventually they would have taken it. They would have crushed me, and I worried they would corrupt my sons. Eleanor didn't see the danger, or maybe she didn't want to. I realized I had only one way out. I couldn't fight them. They were too powerful, too entrenched. So I decided to disappear. Not just me, but the asset they coveted. In October of 1962, I told them I was bankrupt. I cooked the books to show a massive failure. I sold off inventory for cash, secretly, and told them it was seized by creditors. Then, one night, I came here and I sealed it. I boarded the windows from the inside. I put the heaviest lock I could find on the door. I made this place a fortress, a tomb. My goal was to make it so worthless, so inaccessible, that they would simply forget about it. A dead asset is no asset at all. It was my only weapon, to walk away and take the board with me. Eleanor left me. She took the boys and went back to her family, furious that I had thrown away what she saw as a golden opportunity. I let them think I was a failure. It was safer for them. I left Oakhaven with nothing but the cash I had skimmed, and I started over. I became a carpenter, a simple man. I met your mother years later, a world away from all this. She was my second chance. You, my dear girl, were my redemption. Tears were streaming down my face now, dripping onto the fragile paper. I cried for the man I never really knew, for the weight he must have carried every single day. The quiet sadness Earl had mentioned suddenly made sense. It was the ghost of this life, the ghost of this store. He hadn't abandoned it. He had sacrificed it to save himself. He hadn't been a failure. He had been a fighter, in his own quiet, desperate way. The next letter was shorter, more practical. The $2,000 is for you to have a choice. It's enough to get you on your feet, to find a place to live, to start fresh. You can take it, walk away from this place, and never look back. Lock the door behind you and forget Oakhaven exists. There would be no shame in that. It is a gift, freely given. Your safety and happiness are all that ever mattered to me. But there is another choice. The safe in the corner of this office, The combination is your mother's birthday. August 4th, 1956. 8/4/56. Inside, you will find the original deed to this property, free and clear. I paid it off before I left. You will also find more money, enough to pay the back taxes and then some, enough to fix the roof, enough to start again. This is the choice I am giving you, a choice I never had. You can run, or you can build. If you choose to stay, know that you may be stirring up a hornet's nest. Costello is long gone, I'm sure. But greed has a long memory, and networks like his don't just disappear. They evolve. Be careful. Trust your gut. The people of Oakhaven are good people, for the most part. They will help you if you let them. The final letter was just a few lines. One last thing. Your brothers. I love them, but I don't know them anymore. Eleanor's family raised them in that world of shadows and easy money. I don't know if their greed is their own, or if it is an echo of that old poison. Be wary of them, Maya. They see this place as worthless. If they suddenly show an interest, it means the hornets are stirring again. That will be your warning. This store is your inheritance. Not the building, not the land. The story. The choice. Whatever you do, make it your own. Be brave. I love you, Dad. I sat back in the dusty chair, the letters lying in my lap. The silence of the office was no longer empty. It was filled with my father's voice, his love, his fear, his hope. The whole narrative of my life had been rewritten in the space of 10 minutes. I wasn't the abandoned daughter left with scraps. I was the designated heir to a secret, the guardian of a legacy. The feed store wasn't a ruin, it was a shield. It was the physical manifestation of a father's desperate act of protection. The anger I'd felt toward him was replaced by a profound, aching love. He had carried this burden alone for his entire life, all to give me a future free from the shadows that had nearly consumed him. And now, the choice he spoke of was laid out before me, as real and as solid as the stack of money on the desk. Run, or build. My mind was a whirlwind. For a moment, running seemed like the only sane option. Take the $2,000, get on the next bus out, and vanish. My father himself had said there was no shame in it. It was a clean break, a chance at a life unburdened by this dusty, complicated history. I could go to college, get a normal job, be a normal person. Who in their right mind would choose to stay here, in this forgotten town, to fight a shadowy threat over a derelict building? It was insane. It was the plot of a movie, not the rational decision of an 18-year-old with $500 to her name. But then I looked around the small, cramped office. I saw the dust motes dancing in the beam of my flashlight. I touched the solid wood of the desk. This was real. This was his. He had saved this place for me. He had trusted me with his story, with his legacy. To walk away felt like a betrayal. It felt like letting the shadows win. It felt like agreeing with my brothers that this place, and by extension, the part of my father it represented, was worthless. My father had run because he had to. He had no choice. But he had spent the rest of his life making sure that I would. The letters weren't just an explanation, they were a call to action. He hadn't just left me a story, he had left me a mission. And what about my brothers? If they suddenly show an interest, it means the hornets are stirring again. The thought sent a chill through me. Carol had said they waived their claim. Mr. Abernathy had said they considered it a liability. But what if that changed? What if they found out I was here, that I had opened the store? The weight of the decision pressed down on me. I felt impossibly young, impossibly unprepared for this. I was just a kid who had grown up in the system, taught to keep her head down and not make waves. Now I was being asked to stand my ground against, what? A ghost from 1962? My own greedy siblings? It was all too much. I buried my face in my hands, the rough texture of the dusty letters against my palms. I took a deep, shuddering breath, the ancient air filling my lungs. I cried. I cried for the father I had lost twice, once to death, and once to a history I never knew. I cried for the little girl who felt abandoned and alone, and I cried for the young woman who now had to make a choice that felt bigger than her entire life. After a few minutes, the storm of emotion passed, leaving behind a strange, quiet calm. I wiped my eyes, my cheeks streaked with grime. The choice was still there, sitting on the desk. Run or build? Listen, if you've made it this far into my story, you know this feeling. Maybe it wasn't a feed store, maybe it was a relationship, a career, a decision about your own family. You come to a crossroads where the easy path is to walk away, and the hard path is to stay and fight for something that matters, something that feels like it's a part of you. The world tells you to be practical, to cut your losses. But your heart, your gut, tells you something different. It tells you that this is your fight. I want to know if you've ever been there. Drop a comment below and tell me about a time you chose the harder path. Because this community is for people who understand that the most valuable things are the ones you have to fight for. Your stories matter. Now, let's get back to that dusty office. I stood up and walked over to the safe. It was black, squat, and looked impossibly heavy. The combination dial was smooth and cool under my fingertips. My father's voice from the letter echoed in my head. Your mother's birthday. 8/4/56. My hands were steady now. The tears had washed away the panic, leaving behind a cold, clear resolution. I turned the dial. Right to 8. Left, past 8 once, to 4. Right to 56. I pulled the heavy steel handle. There was a low, grinding thud, and the thick door swung open with a groan. The air inside smelled even older, a mix of dry paper and metal. My flashlight beam found the contents. Just as he'd said. On the top shelf was a thick, legal-looking document, tied with a faded red ribbon. The original deed. Below it was a metal cash box. It wasn't locked. I lifted it out. It was heavy. I set it on the desk and opened the lid. It was filled with cash. Older bills, mostly 50s and 100s, neatly stacked. It was far more than the first 2,000. I didn't count it then, but it looked like a small fortune. Enough to pay the taxes, enough to fix the roof, enough to start again. He had given me the tools. The choice was mine to make. And in that moment, standing in the dark, surrounded by the ghosts of his past, the choice became clear. I would not run. I would build. The next morning, I woke up on a makeshift bed of petrified feed sacks, a dusty blanket I'd found in the office pulled over me. My back ached, and I was coated in a fine layer of grime, but I felt a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. The first order of business was to make my decision official. I found the Oak Haven County Clerk's office in a small brick building next to the post office. The woman behind the counter looked at me over her glasses with the same polite curiosity I was starting to get used to. I'm here to pay the back taxes on 14 Main Street, I said, my voice firmer than I expected. The old Vance feed store property. She blinked. All of them? Honey, that's over 3 years of arrears. It's a substantial amount. I'm aware, I said. I had counted the money from the safe. There was $25,000. It was a staggering sum. After setting aside $5,000 for myself, I had taken the exact amount for the taxes, just over $4,000, and put it in my backpack. I laid the cash on the counter. The clerk's eyes widened. She spent the next 20 minutes counting the money, checking records, and stamping forms. As she handed me the receipt, she shook her head. I never thought I'd see the day anyone paid up on that place, she said, not unkindly. Everyone figured it was a teardown. I'm not tearing it down, I said, folding the receipt and putting it in my pocket. I'm opening it back up. Walking out of that office was like stepping into a new life. The deed was clear. The property was truly mine. The weight of the debt was gone, replaced by the weight of the task ahead. The store was a disaster. It needed everything: a new roof, new wiring, plumbing, and a cleaning so thorough it felt like an archaeological dig. I went back to Earl's hardware store. He was arranging a display of garden hoses. He looked up as I walked in. "Well, look who's back," he said with a smile. "You get the door open?" "I did," I said, "and I'm here to open an account." I showed him the tax receipt. He looked at it, then back at me, and a slow grin spread across his weathered face. "Well, I'll be," he said again, the same phrase he'd used when he first met me. Thomas Vance's girl, indeed. "All right, Maya, let's get you started. What do you need first?" That was the beginning of the work. The first week was just cleaning. I bought heavy-duty trash bags, shovels, brooms, and a shop vac. I started at the front and worked my way back. I hauled out the petrified sacks of feed, each one a solid block of ancient grain. They were incredibly heavy, and I had to drag them out to the curb one by one. The town's sanitation department agreed to a special pickup for a fee. I swept away 50 years of dust and grime, revealing the beautiful, wide plank wooden floors underneath. They were scratched and stained, but they were solid. I tore the boards off the inside of the windows, and for the first time in decades, natural light flooded the space. It was glorious. The light changed everything. It chased the ghosts out of the corners and turned the tomb into a room full of potential. The work was brutal, physical, and lonely. My muscles ached constantly. At night, I'd collapse onto my feed sack bed, too tired to even think. But every morning, I woke up and saw the progress I had made, and it was enough. During the day, people would stop and stare. The sight of the feed store, open to the world, was a major event in Oak Haven. Some people would just slow their cars down. Others would walk by and peer in the newly uncovered windows. A few brave souls came in. An older woman named Mrs. Gable, who ran the diner, brought me a container of stew and a thermos of coffee one afternoon. "You can't work on an empty stomach," she said, her expression a mixture of concern and admiration. "Your father would be proud." I started to feel like less of an outsider. I was becoming part of the town's landscape, a curiosity slowly turning into a neighbor. I was the Vance girl, the one fixing up the old feed store. My plan was vague at first. I couldn't reopen it as a feed store. The town didn't need one anymore. But it was a beautiful, big space on Main Street. I thought about a bookstore, a coffee shop, an antique store. For now, the goal was just to make it whole again, to honor the structure itself. The real confrontation came about 2 weeks into the work. I had just finished prying open the seized cash register, finding a handful of silver dollars and tarnished dimes inside, when my phone rang. It was an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something told me I should. "Hello? Is this Maya Vance?" The voice was cold, professional. "Speaking. This is Mr. Abernathy. I was your father's estate lawyer." My stomach clenched. "Yes, hello, Mr. Abernathy. I'm calling on behalf of your brothers, Richard and Mark," he said, his tone clipped and impatient. "They have been made aware that you've taken possession of the Oak Haven property and paid the outstanding tax lien. Word travels fast in a small town." "It's my property," I said, my voice steady. "That's a matter of some debate," he sniffed. "Regardless, a development corporation has made a significant offer for that entire block, including your parcel. They are prepared to offer you $10,000 for the deed, as is. It's a generous offer, considering the state of the building. Your brothers strongly advise you to take it. It would be a quick and clean resolution." $10,000. It was a laughable amount for a commercial building on a main street, even a derelict one. It was just enough money to sound tempting to a desperate kid. It was an insult. And it was the warning my father had written about. The hornets were stirring. Why are they suddenly so interested in a worthless property? I asked, quoting his own past assessment back to him. There was a pause on the other end of the line. The development offer is new, he said, a little too quickly. It represents an opportunity for all parties. The property is not for sale, I said. The words came out with a force that surprised even me. Excuse me? You heard me. It's not for sale. Not for 10,000, not for 100,000. Tell my brothers to leave me alone. Miss Vance, he said, his voice laced with condescending authority. I don't think you understand your position. You are an 18-year-old girl with no resources. This is a life-changing amount of money. Do not make an emotional decision you will regret. The only thing I'd regret is selling my father's legacy to a pack of vultures, I shot back. I know what this place is, and I know who he was. The store is not for sale. Have a nice day, Mr. Abernathy. I hung up before he could respond, my hands shaking with adrenaline. The fight had begun. I had drawn my line in the 50-year-old dust. The phone call with Abernathy lit a fire under me. The vague threat of stirring hornets was now a real and immediate pressure. My brothers, through their lawyer, had shown their hand. They didn't care about the property. They cared about the deal. The $10,000 offer was a test, a lowball attempt to see if I was as naive as they thought I was. My refusal was a declaration of war. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I lay on my cot. I'd upgraded from the feed sacks to a proper folding cot from Earl's, and stared up at the high, pressed tin ceiling, its intricate patterns barely visible in the moonlight filtering through the dusty windows. The building felt different. It was no longer just a project. It was a fortress, and I was its sole defender. I thought about the choices I had. I could still take the money from the safe and leave. The thought was tempting. The fight with my brothers would be ugly, expensive, and exhausting. They had resources. They had lawyers like Abernathy who could tie me up in legal knots for years. What did I have? A crumbling building, a dwindling pile of cash, and a handful of letters from a dead man. But as I lay there, I realized my father had given me more than that. He had given me the truth. He had given me proof, the hidden ledger. That was my weapon. It was a dangerous one. Using it would mean exposing his secret, the crime he had been a victim of so long ago. It would tarnish his name in the service of protecting his legacy. It was a heavy, complicated inheritance. The next day, I started researching. Oakhaven's small library had a surprisingly robust archive of old local newspapers on microfiche. I spent hours scrolling through grainy pages from 1962, looking for any mention of my father, the store, or the name from his letter, Costello. I found it. A small article from November 1962 about the sudden closure of Vance and Son Feed and Supply. It quoted my father as citing economic hardship and announcing his departure from the town. It was a dry, simple article, exactly the kind of cover story he would have wanted. Then I searched for Costello. Anthony Tony Costello. His name appeared a few times in the late 50s and early 60s, usually in the society pages, attending fundraisers or donating to a local charity. He was presented as a prominent local businessman with interests in real estate and transportation. There was no hint of anything illegal. But then, in a paper from 1965, I found his obituary. He died of a heart attack at 50. The article mentioned he was survived by his wife and a network of business associates. The hornet's nest had lost its queen, but the hive remained. The development corporation Abernathy mentioned, it had to be connected. It was the modern face of the same old greed. They weren't just trying to buy land. They were trying to reclaim a piece of their history, a hub they had lost half a century ago. And my brothers, whether knowingly or not, were their agents. The work on the store became my therapy, my protest. Every swing of a hammer, every pry of a crowbar, felt like an act of defiance. I hired a local contractor, a quiet man named Ben, to inspect the roof and the wiring. He quoted me a price that was fair, almost gentle. "Earl told me what you were doing," he said, scratching his neck. "My grandfather used to buy his seed here. It's good to see a light on in the old place." I used the money from the safe to pay him, and his crew started work on the roof the following week. The sight of workers on top of my building, tearing off old shingles and laying down new ones, was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. It was a sign of life, of healing. The community continued to watch, but the curiosity was slowly being replaced by support. Mrs. Gable from the diner made sure I had a hot meal every day. Earl let my tab at the hardware store grow, telling me to pay it when you're turning a profit. Even the mailman, a young guy named Kevin, would stop and chat for a few minutes, telling me he was rooting for me. I wasn't just the Vance girl anymore. I was Maya. I was becoming part of the fabric of the town, just as my father had been. One afternoon, while I was sanding down the old front counter, trying to bring the wood back to life, Earl came in. He was holding a small, dusty wooden box. "Found this in my dad's old desk," he said, setting it on the counter. "After you told me who you were, I went looking. These were your father's." I opened the box. Inside were a few personal effects. A Zippo lighter with the initials TV engraved on it. A worn leather-bound copy of Leaves of Grass. And a photograph. It was of my father, much younger, standing proudly in front of the store. But he wasn't alone. A woman stood beside him, her arm linked through his. She was beautiful, with dark, sad eyes. And standing in front of them were two little boys in matching sailor suits. Richard and Mark. It was his first family, before the rot set in. Before he had to seal his dream away. "That was Eleanor," Earl said softly, pointing to the woman. "She was ambitious. Her family was from out of state, had money, but it was a loud kind of money, if you know what I mean." I knew exactly what he meant. I looked at my father's face in the photo. He was smiling, but there was a tension in his eyes, a hint of the sadness that would later define him. He was a man trying to hold on to a dream that was already slipping through his fingers. "He deserved better," I whispered. "Yes, he did," Earl said. "But he got a second chance. He got you." The new roof was finished. The wiring was brought up to code. The plumbing, which was surprisingly intact, was serviced and working. The store was no longer a hazardous ruin. It was a clean, solid, empty shell. It was beautiful. All that was left was the big question. What would it become? I spent my evenings sitting on the front step, watching the sun go down over Main Street, trying to imagine the future. A coffee shop seemed like the most practical idea. The town had the diner, but no place for people to just sit and talk over a good cup of coffee. A place with comfortable chairs, shelves of books people could borrow. A community living room. I started drawing up plans, sketching layouts in a notebook. I researched espresso machines and suppliers. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but now it was mixed with a heady, thrilling excitement. The project was becoming real. One evening, a sleek black car I didn't recognize pulled up in front of the store. A man in an expensive suit got out. He was my age, maybe a few years older, but he carried himself with an air of unearned authority. He had the same dark hair as the boys in the photograph, the same sharp jawline. He looked at the restored storefront, a flicker of surprise and annoyance in his eyes. "Maya Vance?" he asked. He didn't wait for an answer. "I'm Mark, your brother." It felt like a punch to the gut. Here he was, one of the ghosts from my father's past, made flesh. He wasn't what I expected. He was polished, modern, a world away from the dusty history of this place. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice flat. I didn't get up from the step. "Abernathy said you were..." Unreasonable, he said, gesturing vaguely at the store. I see you've been busy. Look, I don't know what kind of fantasy you're living in, but this is a business transaction. We have a buyer willing to pay a lot of money to demolish this entire block. Your little project is holding things up. It's not for sale, I repeated, my voice like ice. He sighed, a dramatic put-upon sound. Our father let this place rot for a reason. It was a failure. He walked away from it. You should too. The 10,000 is a gift. It's more than he ever left us. The lie was so blatant, so self-serving, it took my breath away. He was erasing our father's sacrifice, rewriting history to fit his own greedy narrative. He was desecrating his memory, right here on the sidewalk. You're wrong, I said, my voice shaking with a sudden hot rage. He didn't walk away. He was pushed. He didn't let it rot. He sealed it to protect it from people like you. From the world you came from. Mark's smooth facade cracked. A flash of genuine anger showed in his eyes. You don't know anything, he sneered. You're a sentimental little girl playing house in a ruin. And you're a grave robber, picking at the bones of a man you never even knew, I retorted. We stared at each other for a long moment, the silence thick with animosity. The family resemblance was there, in the set of our eyes, the shape of our faces. But the connection ended there. We were from different worlds, fighting over the soul of the man who linked us. Take the deal, Maya, he said, his voice low and threatening now. It's your last chance. This is going to happen, with or without you. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. He got back in his car and sped away, leaving behind the smell of exhaust and a cold dread in the pit of my stomach. The hornets weren't just stirring anymore. They were at the gate. His visit was the final push I needed. The choice was no longer abstract. It had a face and a name. It had my brother's sneer and his casual cruelty. The next morning, I went to see Mr. Abernathy. Not my brother's lawyer, but a different one. A woman named Sarah Mills, whose office was in the next town over. She was young, sharp, and had a reputation for fighting for the underdog. I laid everything out on her desk. The deed, the tax receipt, my father's letters, and the hidden ledger. She read through the letters first, her expression growing more and more serious. Then she examined a ledger. She spent a long time on it, her finger tracing the columns of names and numbers. This is dynamite, she said at last, looking up at me, her eyes wide. This is a record of a criminal conspiracy. Your father was incredibly brave to keep this. My brother Mark visited me yesterday, I told her. He threatened me. He said they have a developer and that the sale is going to happen, with or without me. Sarah leaned back in her chair. They'll probably try to have you declared an unfit administrator of the property. They'll argue you're a minor in all but name, emotionally unstable, and that you're irrationally blocking a profitable transaction that's in the best interest of the estate, even though the estate is closed. Can they do that? They can try. It'll be messy and expensive. They're hoping you'll fold. She tapped the ledger. But this changes the game. This gives us leverage. We can't prove their developer is connected to this old network. Not easily. But the implication, hide with your father's testimony in these letters. It's powerful. It's a story a judge, and frankly, the press, would find very compelling. The thought of dragging my father's name and his secrets into the public eye made me sick. I don't want to do that, I said. I just want them to leave me alone. I understand, Sarah said gently. So we use it as a shield, not a sword. We let them know that we have it. A carefully worded letter from my office to Mr. Abernathy, letting him know that any legal action against you will be met with a countersuit that will bring your father's full story, including this ledger, into public discovery. We call their bluff. It was a terrifying gamble, but it was the only one I had. Do it, I said. While the lawyers exchanged their veiled threats, I threw myself back into the work. It was my only sanctuary. I finalized my plan for the coffee shop. I called it the second chance. It felt right. I used the last of the money from the safe to buy a used commercial espresso machine and a grinder from a restaurant auction. I found beautiful mismatched old armchairs and tables at a flea market. Earl helped me build a long, beautiful counter out of reclaimed barnwood. The store began to transform. It was no longer just an empty space. It was taking on a personality. It was becoming a home. A week after my meeting with Sarah, she called me. "They're backing off," she said, a note of triumph in her voice. "Abernathy called me this morning. His clients have reconsidered their position. The development offer has been withdrawn. They're waiving any and all future claims to the property." I sank onto a stool, my knees weak with relief. "It's over?" "For now," she said. "They folded. They didn't want that ledger coming out any more than you did. You won, Maya." I had won. I had faced the ghosts of the past and my own fear, and I had won. That evening, I stood in the middle of the nearly finished coffee shop. The setting sun streamed through the clean windows, bathing the room in a warm, golden light. The smell of fresh paint and sawdust had replaced the smell of dust and decay. It was a place of hope, a place of new beginnings. It was my father's legacy and my future, all under one new roof. My inheritance wasn't the $27,000 he had hidden for me. It wasn't the building itself, it was the story. It was the understanding that home isn't something you're given. It's something you build, something you fight for. It's the choice to turn a ruin into a refuge. My father had lost his first dream, but he had given me the tools to build my own. I think a lot about the idea of inheritance. We think of it as money or property or things. But maybe the most valuable things we're left with are the stories, the lessons, the second chances. My father left me a building, yes, but what he really left me was a choice. He taught me that you can't run from the past, but you don't have to be buried by it either. You can build on top of it. You can take the broken pieces and make something new, something that's entirely your own. This store is more than a business to me. It's a testament to a father's love. It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, when it feels like everything is lost, there is always the possibility of a new beginning. It's a second chance, not just for a building, but for me. The work isn't over. The fight with my brothers left scars, and the memory of their greed is a wound that will take time to heal. But for the first time in my life, I feel like I have a home. Not just a roof over my head, but a place in the world. A place I chose. A place I built. This whole journey started with what felt like an ending, with being left with what everyone considered nothing. And I guess that's the lesson I want to share with all of you. Sometimes the things that look like liabilities are actually opportunities in disguise. The endings are really just beginnings. The things people discard are the things that hold the most value. It's about having the courage to look closer, to dig deeper, and to see the potential that everyone else missed. My story is about a feed store, but it's also about reclaiming your own narrative. It's about deciding that you won't be defined by what you've lost, but by what you choose to build. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to fight for your own second chance, I hope you'll subscribe and become part of this community. I read every comment, and I believe in the power of sharing our stories. Tell me, what's the forgotten feed store in your life? What did you build from the ruins? Thank you for listening.